The dust of Harmony Creek settled on everything, a fine tan powder that coated the soul as much as the skin. It clung to the unpainted clapboard of the general store, muted the green of the wilting sagebrush, and settled in the deep lines around Cale's eyes as he stood before the teller's window in the Oregon High Desert Bank. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth-old paper and the faint metallic tang of coin. It was a smell Cale knew, but had long tried to forget, a scent that belonged to a world he had abandoned. He was a man built of sharp angles and quiet purpose. His Modoc heritage etched in the high planes of his cheekbones, and the straight black hair he kept tied back with a simple leather thong. The townsfolk knew him only as Cale, the quiet recluse who lived in the shadow of the Three Sisters Mountains, trading well-tanned pelts for flour salt and solitude. They did not know the name he had carried before Black Wolf, a name whispered by outlaws and lawmen alike, a name synonymous with relentless pursuit and unshakable justice. He had buried that name, along with his marshal's star, 5 years ago. That'll be $4.60 the teller. A young man named Peterson, with a nervous twitch in his left eye, said. Cale slid a stack of coins across the polished wood. As he did, the doors to the bank burst open, swinging inward with a violent crash that sent a shockwave of silence through the room. 2 men stood silhouetted against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. They were wrapped in dusters, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. The taller one held a Colt Peacemaker, its barrel looking as wide and dark as a cave entrance. Nobody move. He barked, his voice a gravelly command that scraped against the sudden dead quiet. Gunshots echoed, glass shattered. Cale hit the floor. Years of training took over a muscle memory that grief had failed to erase. His body moved with a fluid economy, tucking into a low crouch behind an overturned writing desk. His hand instinctively went to the Colt holstered at his hip, the worn leather a familiar comfort. He was a ghost in this room, a shadow they had not accounted for. The robbers were professionals. One covered the entrance, while the other vaulted over the counter, shoving a canvas sack at the terrified Peterson. All of it now. Panic erupted. A woman screamed. The bank manager, a portly man named Abernathy, fumbled for a pistol hidden in his desk drawer. It was a fool's move. The outlaw at the door saw the motion, his pistol barking once. The bullet tore through the wood of the desk, and Abernathy cried out, clutching a hand that was suddenly slick with blood. Cale remained still, a predator waiting for the perfect moment. He tracked their movements, cataloging their weaknesses. The man at the door was jumpy, his eyes darting everywhere. The one behind the counter was focused, the leader. But their attention was on the money, on the fear they were sowing. They hadn't seen him. Not really. He began to calculate his move. 2 targets. He could take the one at the door first, then the leader. It would be clean quick. It was the marshal's way. It was Black Wolf's way. But he was not Black Wolf anymore. He was Cale. And Cale wanted no part of this. He had come to town for supplies, not to bleed for a town that barely knew his name. His only purpose was to endure, to live out the quiet penance he had set for himself. Then the leader, having filled his sack, turned his attention to the customers huddled on the floor. His eyes, cold and dark over the edge of his bandana, swept across them. They landed on Cale. He saw not a threat, but an opportunity. "You," the outlaw snarled, pointing the barrel of his Colt at him. "On your feet." Cale rose slowly, his hands held out to his sides, open and empty. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of stone he had perfected long ago. The outlaw stalked toward him, his boots scuffing on the floorboards. He was looking for more than loose change. His gaze fell upon the thin silver chain around Cale's neck, tucked beneath the collar of his shirt. With a quick, brutal tug, he ripped it free. A gasp escaped Kyle's lips, a sound more of soul than of air. It was a sound of pure violation. The outlaw held up the prize, a simple silver locket tarnished with age. He flicked it open with his thumb. Inside, protected by a delicate pane of glass, was a miniature portrait hand-painted with painstaking detail. A woman with warm, smiling eyes and hair the color of sun-cured wheat. Leela. Pretty little thing. The outlaw sneered, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. He snapped the locket shut and shoved it into his pocket. A bonus for my trouble. Something inside Cale broke. The carefully constructed dam of grief and resignation that had held him together for 5 years fractured, and a cold, focused rage poured through the cracks. That locket was not jewelry. It was a relic. It was the last piece of a life that had been stolen from him and the only image he had left of the woman who had been his world. It was his heart memorialized in silver and paint. The world narrowed to the man standing before him. The screams, the crying, the smell of gunpowder, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the thief, the desecrator. Cale's eyes, which had been passive and distant moments before, now burned with a fire that had once made hardened men lay down their arms. The outlaw saw the change. He saw the shift from prey to predator. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He took a half step back. "Stay where you are," he warned, raising his pistol. But Cale was already moving. He lunged forward, not with the reckless fury of an angry man, but with the deadly precision of a trained hunter. He slapped the gun aside as it fired the bullet, splintering the wall behind him. His other hand chopped down on the outlaw's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. Kyle's body flowed into the man's, using his momentum against him. A sharp, calculated strike to the throat sent the outlaw staggering back, choking and gasping. The second robber, seeing his partner fall, spun around, raising his pistol. But Cale was a blur of motion. He had already scooped up the fallen colt. He didn't aim. He didn't need to. He fired from the hip, a single deafening shot. The bullet struck the second outlaw's gun hand, sending his weapon clattering across the floor. The man howled in pain, clutching his shattered fingers. The bank fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the whimpers of the wounded and the ragged, desperate gasps of the disarmed leader. Kyle stood over him, the smoking pistol steady in his hand. "The locket," he said, his voice low and cold, a sound like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken since the robbery began, and the words carried an absolute chilling authority. The outlaw, wheezing on the floor, clawed at his pocket. His hand trembled as he pulled out the silver locket and held it up. Kyle snatched it from his grasp, his fingers closing around the cool metal. He checked that it was undamaged, his thumb stroking the smooth, familiar surface. Then he looked down at the man, and for a fleeting moment, the lawman and the warriors merged. Justice demanded a price. But as he looked into the outlaw's terrified eyes, he saw not a monster, but a common, pathetic thief. And he saw Lila's face in his mind, her gentle spirit, a stark contrast to the violence he held in his hand. Killing this man would not bring her back. It would only drag him further into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. With a final contemptuous look, he holstered the pistol. The town guard would be here any moment. His work was done. He turned and walked toward the door, the locket clutched tight in his fist. "Wait, Sheriff Miller." A man whose ambition far outstripped his competence yelled as he burst through the doorway, his own gun drawn far too late. "Who are you? What happened here?" Kyle didn't stop. He pushed past the flustered sheriff and stepped out into the harsh afternoon light, leaving the chaos and confusion behind. He had what he came for. He had retrieved the last piece of his heart. But as he walked away, he could feel the cold weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders. He had shown the town and himself a glimpse of the man he used to be. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Black Wolf was not as deeply buried as he had hoped. The cabin was his sanctuary, a small sturdy structure he had built himself nestled deep in a stand of ponderosa pines. It was a place of quiet ritual. The rhythmic chop of the axe, the slow simmer of stew over the fire, the careful tanning of hides, these were the things that kept the ghosts at bay. Here, surrounded by the immense, indifferent silence of the mountains, he could almost forget. He sat at his rough-hewn table, the silver locket resting in the palm of his hand. The lamp cast a warm golden glow, illuminating the fine scratches and dents that marred its surface, each one a memory. He opened it and gazed at the portrait of Lila. Her smile was a soft, gentle thing, a quiet light that had once been the anchor of his world. She was a schoolteacher from the East, full of books and wonder, who had seen past the fearsome reputation of the half-Modic marshal and found the man beneath. She had taught him how to read poetry, how to find beauty in a sunset, how to be more than just the weapon the law had made him. His mind drifted back to the fire. It had been a simple accident, a stray ember from the hearth, catching a dry curtain while he was away tracking a band of rustlers near the border. That's what the official report said. An accident. He had returned to find his home, his life reduced to a heap of smoldering ash and blackened timbers. They told him her death had been quick, that she hadn't suffered. But the words were hollow. He had failed to protect her. The one thing that mattered, the one person he was sworn to keep safe. And he had been miles away chasing shadows for a government that cared nothing for his heart. He quit the marshals the next day. He left his name, his star, and his past in the ashes of his home, and rode north until the world he knew was just a bitter memory. He came to this isolated corner of Oregon, seeking a place where no one would know the name Black Wolf. He had found it in Harmony Creek. For 5 years the penance had worked. The quiet was a balm, the solitude a shield. But the robbery had shattered that peace. The casual brutality of the outlaw, with a violation of Lila's memory, had reawakened the part of him he had tried to kill. He felt the old instincts stirring the sharp, analytical mind of the manhunter beginning to work. The robbery had been too smooth, too professional for common thugs. And their leader's focus on him on the locket felt personal. It was a provocation. But why? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound faint and distant carried on the evening breeze. It was a sound that did not belong in the wilderness. A baby crying. Cale stood, his body tensing. He moved to the door, stepping out onto the small porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He scanned the horizon, his eyes trained to spot the slightest movement sweeping across the vast expanse of sage and juniper. The crying grew louder, more desperate. It was coming from the east, from the direction of the old Miller homestead, a patch of land most folks considered cursed. A young widow had bought it a year ago, a foolhardy woman trying to carve a life from the unforgiving soil. He had seen her in town a few times, a determined set to her jaw, an infant strapped to her chest. He had kept his distance. Her struggle was not his concern. But the sound of that child's cry was a hook in his soul. It was a sound of pure, helpless distress. He lingered for a moment, torn. To get involved was to risk everything he had built here. But to ignore it felt like a betrayal of the man Lila had believed him to be. He strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight, a grim reassurance. He pulled a rifle from the rack by the door and checked its load. The quiet was over. Something was wrong at the Miller place, and the ghosts of his past would not let him turn away. He set off through the twilight, the locket tucked safely back under his shirt, its cool metal, a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he was now unwillingly being forced to protect. He moved through the landscape like a spirit, silent and unseen. The last rays of sunlight bled from the sky, and a deep, star-dusted indigo settled over the desert. He knew this land, its rhythms, and its secrets. He followed the sound of the crying, which grew more frantic as he drew closer to the homestead. The place was unnervingly still. No light burned in the windows of the small sod-roofed house. No smoke curled from the chimney. A deep sense of foreboding settled over Cale. He slowed his approach, using the cover of the rocks and sagebrush his rifle held at the ready. He saw the tracks first and the prints of at least 3 shod horses, their deep impressions indicating they had been ridden hard. They had circled the house before moving off toward a dilapidated well near the edge of the property. Cale's eyes followed the tracks, his mind piecing together the story they told. There were scuff marks in the dirt and the signs of a struggle. He reached the well, its stone lip crumbling with age. The heavy wooden cover had been dragged back into place, and a thick timber was wedged against it, pinning it shut. And from within, from the darkness below, came the sound. The baby's desperate wails, now accompanied by the faint, pleading voice of a woman. Cale's blood ran cold. This was not a robbery. This was an execution, slow and cruel. He holstered his rifle and put his shoulder to the timber. It was heavy, wedged tight. He strained the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching. With a final grunting heave, the timber scraped free. He tossed it aside and gripped the edge of the wooden cover. It was waterlogged and heavy, but he managed to slide it back, revealing a black, circular maw. "Hello," he called down, his voice echoing in the confined space. The crying stopped abruptly. A moment of silence, and then a woman's voice, hoarse and trembling, floated up from the darkness. "Is someone there? Please help us." "Hold on," Cale said. "I'm getting you out." He found the rope and crank system, old but still functional. He lowered the bucket, its chain rattling against the stone walls of the well. "The bucket's coming down. Put the child in it first." He heard fumbling from below, the mother's soothing whispers and the baby's whimpering cries. After a long minute, her voice came again, strained with effort. "He's in. Please be careful." Cale began to turn the crank, hauling the rope up hand over hand. It was a slow, agonizing process. The weight was slight, but the responsibility it represented was immense. Finally, the bucket emerged from the darkness. Inside, wrapped in a swaddling cloth, was a small infant, his face red and tear-streaked, but otherwise unharmed. Cale gently lifted the baby out and set him down on a soft patch of grass. He lowered the bucket again. "It's your turn." The woman was weak. He could feel it in the way she struggled to get into the bucket. He pulled her up with slow, steady turns of the crank. When she finally reached the surface, she was a mess of dirt and tears, her dress torn, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. She scrambled out of the well and immediately crawled to her son, gathering him into her arms and holding him tight, rocking back and forth as she sobbed with relief. Cale gave her a moment, his gaze sweeping the horizon, alert for any sign of returning riders. He recognized her now as Alara, the widow from town. She had a strength about her, a resilience that even this ordeal had not completely extinguished. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes a startling shade of green, filled with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. They just left us. They said Mr. Croft sends his regards." The name landed like a stone in Cale's gut. Silas Croft. A wealthy rancher who had been buying up land all over the county, often through intimidation and threats. Cale had heard the whispers in town. But this was different. This was not a business transaction. This was an act of monstrous cruelty. "Why, Cale?" asked, his voice flat. He wants my land, Alara said, clutching her son Samuel tighter. It has the only year-round spring in this valley. My husband, he refused to sell. After he died, I refused. They've been trying to scare me off for months. But I never thought. Her voice trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the dark mouth of the well. Cale's personal quest for his locket had just collided with something far more dangerous. He had tracked the bank robbers out of a need to reclaim his past. Now, standing over this woman and her child, he was being dragged into a fight for their future. The tracks he had followed from the bank led in this same general direction. It was no coincidence. The men who had left Alara to die and the men who had stolen his locket were one and the same. They worked for Silas Croft. And Croft had not just tried to kill this woman. He had provoked Cale personally. The theft of the locket was a message, a challenge. Croft knew who he was. Alara looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. She saw the hardness in his eyes, the rifle in his hand, the way he stood as if he were a part of the unyielding landscape itself. She saw a man who was more than just a quiet trapper. "Who are you?" she asked, a new kind of fear creeping into her voice. Kyle looked from her terrified face to the sleeping infant in her arms. He thought of the locket safe against his chest. He thought of the life he had tried so hard to leave behind. That life had found him. "My name is Cale," he said, "and we need to get off this land. Now." His personal quest was over. A new, far deadlier one had just begun. There was no time for rest. The men who had left Alara and Samuel to die would eventually return, if only to confirm their grim work was done. Kyle knew their kind. Their cruelty was matched only by their arrogance. He led Alara away from the homestead, moving southwest toward the jagged, broken country of the Canyonlands, a maze of rock and shadow where a man could disappear if he knew the way. Alara, though exhausted, matched his pace. She carried Samuel bundled against her chest, her earlier fear replaced by a silent, fierce resolve. She asked no questions, understanding instinctively that survival depended on speed and silence. They traveled for 2 hours under a canopy of brilliant stars, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the gravelly soil and the whisper of the wind through the sage. Kyle moved with a purpose that was both comforting and unsettling. He was a man at home in the harshness of the wild, reading the land as easily as Lila had once read her books. They finally stopped in a deep, narrow arroyo, its high walls providing cover from the open plains. "We'll rest here until dawn," Kyle said, his voice a low murmur. He slid his rifle off his shoulder and took up a watch position at the mouth of the gully. His silhouette a dark, unmoving sentinel against the starlit sky. Alara settled down with Samuel, who had fallen into the deep, untroubled sleep of infancy. She watched Cale, this stranger who had appeared from the twilight like a myth. The people in Harmony Creek spoke of him in hushed tones, the quiet half-Modoc man who kept to himself. They said he was haunted. Looking at him now, she understood why. There was a profound sorrow in his stillness, a weight that seemed to anchor him to the earth. But there was also a competence, a dangerous grace that radiated from him like heat from a fire. "They'll come after us, won't they?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Kyle didn't turn. "Yes." "Because of me or because of you?" His silence was her answer. The attack on her farm, the robbery in town, it was all connected. And he was at the center of it. "Croft knows who you are," she stated, not a question. "He seems to," Cale replied, his voice tight. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray, and Rose, Cale's posture stiffened. He had heard it before she did, the faint, rhythmic drumming of approaching horses. He motioned for her to stay down, to keep the baby quiet. He peered over the edge of the arroyo. 3 riders were cresting a nearby ridge, moving at a steady, confident pace. They were following their tracks. They were the same men from the homestead. "Stay here," Cale commanded in a whisper. "Do not make a sound no matter what you hear." He moved away from her, melting into the rocks and shadows of the canyon wall. He climbed with the silent agility of a mountain cat, finding handholds and footholds in the sheer rock face. He positioned himself on a high ledge that overlooked the entrance to the arroyo, a perfect sniper's perch. He laid his rifle on the rock before him, the long barrel resting steady, and waited. The riders drew closer, their conversation drifting on the morning air. "Told you we should have just shot him," one grumbled. "Leaving him in a well, too fancy for my taste." "Croft wanted it quiet," the leader replied. "Wanted her to just disappear. Makes it easier to file the claim." "Well, she ain't disappeared," the third man said, pointing down at the tracks leading directly into the arroyo. "And she had help." They reined in their horses at the gully's entrance, their expressions shifting from arrogance to caution. The leader dismounted, drawing his pistol. "Check it out. Be ready for anything." He took a few steps into the narrow passage, his eyes scanning the shadows. Kyle watched him through his rifle sights, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He could end it right now. One shot, but that would bring the other 2 down on him, and Alara and Samuel would be caught in the crossfire. He had to be smarter. He had to use the land as a weapon. He waited until the leader was deep inside the arroyo, out of sight of his companions. Then Cale shifted his aim. He fired not at the man, but at the rock face just above him. The shot cracked through the morning stillness, a sound like the sky splitting open. The bullet slammed into the loose shale, sending a shower of rock and dust cascading down. The leader cried out in alarm, stumbling back as stones rained around him. The 2 riders outside reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and spurring their horses forward. It was exactly what Kyle had wanted. They were charging into a trap. As they entered the narrowest part of the passage, Cale fired again. This time, his target was the lead horse. The animal screamed and went down, its body collapsing in a heap that completely blocked the path. The second rider was forced to pull up short, his horse rearing in panic. Chaos erupted in the confined space. The unhorsed rider scrambled to his feet, firing wildly up at the canyon walls. The mounted one fought to control his terrified animal. The leader, recovering from the rock slide, began to rush back toward the entrance. Cale worked the lever of his rifle with practiced speed. He was not aiming to kill. Not yet. He was dismantling them piece by piece. His next shot tore through the mounted man's saddlebag, sending a canteen spinning into the air. The man yelped, startled, his attention now fixed on the ledge where the shots were coming from. This gave the leader the opening he needed. He burst from the arroyo, firing his pistol up at Cale's position. Bullets ricocheted off the rock near Cale's head, sending stone chips flying. Cale ducked back the shots far too close for comfort. He had their attention. They were pinned down, confused and angry. Now for the final move. He crawled back from the ledge, circling around through a series of hidden crevices and passages that only he knew. He moved with breathtaking speed, his moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the rock. In less than a minute, he had emerged from the canyon wall behind them. They were still focused on the ledge, firing intermittent shots, shouting at each other. They never saw him coming. "Drop them," Kyle said, his voice calm and deadly. The 2 men froze. They turned slowly, their faces a mask of disbelief and fear. Kyle stood 20 feet away, his rifle leveled at them. The hunter had become the hunted. The unhorsed man, his face a mask of bravado, started to raise his pistol. "You're just one man." Cale's rifle fired. The bullet kicked up a cloud of dust just inches from the man's boot. The next one won't miss. The man's bravado vanished. He dropped his pistol as if it were red hot. The other man, seeing the cold, unwavering certainty in Cale's eyes, slowly raised his hands and let his own gun fall to the ground. Ilara, hearing the sudden silence, dared to peek out from her hiding place. She saw Cale standing over the two disarmed men, a figure of absolute authority. She had never witnessed such a display of calculated, efficient violence. He had not killed them, but he had utterly defeated them, using the terrain, their own aggression, and his formidable skill to take them apart. Croft's suspicions had just been confirmed in the most definitive way possible. He had sent 3 thugs to do a simple, cruel job. They had run into Black Wolf. The war was no longer a secret. It was now out in the open. Cale tied the men's hands securely as knots quick and efficient. He left them their horses. "Ride back to your boss," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Tell Silas Croft that Ilara and her son are under my protection. Tell him to leave them alone." The leader, the same man who had sneered at Lila's portrait in the bank, glared at him with pure hatred. "Croft will not be happy. You just signed your own death warrant." "He already signed it when he sent you to steal from me," Kyle replied, his hand unconsciously touching the locket beneath his shirt. He watched them ride away, their humiliation, a palpable cloud of dust trailing behind them. He knew this was not an end, but an escalation. He had shown his hand. Croft now knew for certain that the quiet trapper was the U.S. Marshal who had disappeared 5 years ago. And a man like Croft would not be deterred by a single setback. He would double his efforts. Cale returned to Ilara. She was standing now holding Samuel, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. She had seen the warrior, and it frightened her as much as it gave her hope. "We need to get to town," Cale said, his tone all business. "You won't be safe at your homestead, not anymore. You can stay at the boarding house. I'll speak to Sheriff Miller." The journey to Harmony Creek was tense. Kyle was no longer just a guide. He was a bodyguard. His head was on a constant swivel, his senses alert to any sign of ambush. They traveled through the harshest, most difficult terrain, a path that would be impossible for Croft's men to predict. When they finally saw the dusty rooftops of the town, Ilara breathed a sigh of relief. But Cale felt no such comfort. A town was not a fortress. It was a collection of people, and people could be bought, bullied, or broken. They walked down the main street, a spectacle that drew curious stares from every window and doorway. The sight of the reclusive Cale walking beside the widow Ilara, who looked as if she had been through a war, was enough to set the town's gossip mill churning for a month. Cale took her directly to the sheriff's office. Miller was sitting with his feet up on his desk, looking bored. He nearly fell out of his chair when they entered. "Cale and Mrs. Collins, what in thunderation happened to you?" Cale cut straight to the point. "Croft's men tried to kill her and her son. They trapped them in a dry well on her property." Miller's face went pale. He stood up sputtering. "Silas Croft. Are you sure he's a respected businessman, a pillar of this community?" "He's a murderer." Ilara interrupted, her voice shaking with anger. "His men told me themselves. They said he sent his regards. I ran into 3 of them this morning." Kyle added, his voice like ice. "They confirmed it. I sent them back to their boss with a message. Croft won't stop. She needs protection." Miller wrung his hands, his gaze shifting nervously around the room, as if Croft himself might be listening from the shadows. "Protection, Cale, you have to understand. Croft practically owns this town. The bank, the freight company. Half the men on the town council are on his payroll. I can't just go and accuse a man like that." "I'm not asking you to accuse him," Kyle said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm telling you that a citizen of this town was the victim of an attempted murder. It's your job to do something about it. My job is to keep the peace, Miller retorted, his voice rising in panic. Going after Croft is a surefire way to start a war. I don't have the men or the resources to fight him. It was then that Cale understood the true depth of the problem. The law in Harmony Creek was a hollow shell, and Silas Croft was the man pulling the strings. There would be no help here. They were on their own. He turned to Alara. The boarding house is no good. His men will be watching it. You'll stay with me. The words hung in the air, shocking both Alara and the sheriff. For Cale, the man who had built a fortress of solitude around himself to offer his home to another, was unthinkable. It was a profound shift, a crack in the armor he had worn for 5 long years. Alara hesitated. To go with this dangerous, enigmatic man was a risk. But to stay here in a town run by a coward was a death sentence. She looked at Samuel sleeping peacefully in her arms, and her choice was made. "All right," she said, her voice firm. They left the sheriff's office, leaving Miller to his indecision and his fear. As they stepped back out into the street, Kyle felt a new kind of weight settle on him. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was now a shield for 2 innocent people standing against a storm he himself had in some way summoned. He began to walk them toward the general store to gather supplies for a long siege, his mind already working, planning and investigating. If the law wouldn't help, he would have to uncover Croft's operations himself. He needed to find a weakness, a chink in the armor of the man who ruled Harmony Creek. And he suspected the answers lay buried in the past, in the old case files of a U.S. Marshal named Black Wolf. Over the next few days, a strange, quiet routine established itself at Kyle's remote cabin. Alara, practical and resilient, turned the small masculine space into a home. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended Kyle's worn clothes, her presence softening the cabin's hard edges. Samuel's gurgles and cries filled the silence that had once been Kyle's only companion. At first, the domesticity was jarring to Kyle. It was a painful echo of the life he had lost with Lila. But slowly he found a quiet comfort in it. It gave his fight a tangible purpose, a reason that went beyond vengeance or duty. During the day, Cale would leave melting into the wilderness to watch Croft's ranch from a distance. He was a ghost on the ridges, his spyglass his only weapon. He observed the comings and goings, noting the number of men Croft employed. They were not common ranch hands. They moved with a discipline that spoke of military training or a long-storied career in banditry. They were a small army, loyal and well-armed. In the evenings, he and Alara would talk. He would ask her questions about the people Croft had driven off their land. She had a sharp mind and a good memory. There was the Abernathy family, she recalled one night while rocking Samuel by the fire. They owned the parcel just north of me. Their barn burned down in the middle of the night. They were lucky to get out alive. They sold to Croft for pennies on the dollar and left the territory. And the Garzas, she continued. Their cattle came down with a mysterious sickness. All of them. Wiped out their entire herd in a week. They had no choice but to sell. A pattern began to emerge. Each incident was designed to look like misfortune or an act of God. But the result was always the same. Another piece of land fell into Croft's hands. Kyle took out an old map of the county and began to mark the properties. As he placed an X over each parcel, a cold dread began to creep up his spine. The locations were not random. The Abernathy farm was where he had arrested the McCoy brothers after a 3-day siege. The Garza ranch bordered the canyon where he had cornered the infamous train robber gentleman Jack Sinclair. Each property Croft had acquired was a landmark from his past, a place where Marshal Black Wolf had delivered justice. This was not about land or water rights. This was a systematic erasure of his legacy. Croft was not just building an empire. He was desecrating Cale's history, turning his triumphs into tragedies for innocent people. The sheer, obsessive hatred behind the plan was staggering. To confirm his theory, he needed more information. He needed to get his hands on one of Croft's men, someone high enough up to know the full scope of the plan. He began to watch the supply wagons that ran between Croft's ranch and Harmony Creek. There was one man, a burly, red-bearded lieutenant named Finn, who often drove the route alone. He was arrogant and careless. He was the weak link. Cale planned the ambush with meticulous care. He chose a spot where the trail narrowed, forcing the wagon to slow down. He felled a small tree across the path, creating an obstacle that would force Finn to dismount. When Finn's wagon rumbled into view, Cale was hidden in the rocks above his rifle, ready. Finn cursed when he saw the fallen tree. He climbed down from the wagon, grumbling to himself, and began to try and drag the tree aside. He had left his own rifle in the wagon, his pistol, his only defense. Cale descended from the rocks as silently as a hawk's shadow. "Leave it," he said. Finn spun around his hand, flying to his gun. But he froze when he saw the barrel of Cale's rifle pointed squarely at his chest. "I wouldn't," Cale advised calmly. He disarmed Finn and tied him to a sturdy juniper tree well off the main trail. The interrogation was not a physical one. Cale had learned long ago that fear and psychology were far more effective tools than pain. He didn't ask about Croft. He didn't ask about the land. He started with something Finn would never expect. "Tell me about Jedediah Stone." Cale said, his voice quiet. Finn's eyes widened in shock. Jedediah Stone was a young, notoriously violent outlaw Cale had tracked across 3 states 5 years ago. Their final confrontation had been at an abandoned way station, a property now owned by Silas Croft. I don't know who you're talking about," Finn stammered. "Don't lie to me," Cale said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I was the marshal who put him in the ground. I know you were part of his gang. You were the one who got away. I remember your face." The lie was seamless. Cale had no memory of Finn, but he knew the gang had a 4th member who had escaped. The shot in the dark hit its mark. Finn's composure crumbled. He believed Cale was a ghost from his past, come to settle an old score. "It wasn't my fault," Finn blurted out, panic seizing him. "Jed was reckless. He wouldn't listen." "And now you work for Croft," Cale continued, pressing his advantage. "A man who seems to have a keen interest in all my old cases. A strange coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Finn remained silent, his face a mask of terror. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Cale said, moving closer, his presence utterly menacing. "Why is Silas Croft digging up my past?" Finn broke. The words came pouring out of him in a desperate, terrified rush. "His name isn't Croft, not his real name. It's Stone. Silas Stone. Jedediah was his younger brother." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. It was a vendetta. Deeply, horrifically personal. Jed was all he had left. Finn explained, his voice trembling. Silas was the smart one, the planner. Jed was the muscle. When you killed Jed, something in Silas, it snapped. He blamed you. He said you were reckless, that you executed his brother when you could have taken him alive. Cale remembered the arrest clearly. Jedediah had come out of the way station with a gun in each hand, firing wildly. He had given Cale no choice. It had been a lawful, if bloody, end. But in a brother's grief-stricken mind, it had become a murder. He spent the last 5 years building his fortune planning. This Finn continued. He found me and the others, men you'd crossed or men who just hated the law. He paid us well. The land grab, it was all a game to him, a way to draw you out. He wanted to take away everything you ever stood for, ruin your name, and then, when you had nothing left, he was going to kill you. He wanted to make you suffer, Marshall. Suffer like he did. The truth was more monstrous than Cale could have imagined. He was not fighting a greedy land baron. He was fighting a phantom, a man consumed by a grief so profound it had twisted into a meticulous, all-consuming engine of revenge. Silas Croft, Silas Stone, had orchestrated a 5-year campaign of terror, all to settle a score with a man he believed had wronged him. Cale's own grief suddenly felt small in comparison to the vast dark ocean of Croft's hatred. He had retreated from the world in sorrow. Croft had set out to burn it down. He looked at Finn, a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. There was nothing more to be gained from him. Kyle cut him loose. "Go," Cale said. "I won't kill you, but if I ever see you again, I will." Finn scrambled to his feet and ran, not even bothering with the wagon. He fled into the wilderness, a man terrified of the 2 ghosts he had just betrayed. Cale stood alone in the silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. This was not about land. This was not about Alara. It had always been about him. And now Croft knew that Cale knew. The game was over. The pretense was gone. All that was left was the final bloody confrontation. And Croft would make sure it happened on his terms, in a place of his own choosing. The air at the cabin was thick with an unspoken tension. When Kyle returned and told Alara what he had learned, the full gravity of their situation settled upon them. They were not just obstacles in a land dispute. They were pawns in a madman's game of revenge. Alara, her face pale, but her expression resolute, understood that her fate was now irrevocably tied to Cale's past. "He will come for us," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Now that you know the truth, he has no reason to wait." "I know," Kyle replied. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical, a ritual to calm the storm raging inside him. "He'll want to finish this, and he'll want to do it in a place that has meaning." They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, as the sun began its descent, a lone rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the cabin. He carried a white flag of truce. Kyle met him in the open, his hand never far from his Colt. The rider was a man Kyle didn't recognize, his face impassive. He handed Kyle a sealed envelope and, without a word, turned his horse and rode away. Kyle broke the seal. The note was written in a fine, elegant script, a stark contrast to the brutal message it contained. "Marshall, the game of whispers is over. I have taken something of yours, your new family. If you wish to see the woman and her child again, you will come to the place where my family ended. The Stardust Mine. Come alone. Come at dawn. Let us finish what you started." Snes. Cale's heart turned to ice. He spun around and raced back to the cabin. It was empty. The fire was still warm. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the table. A small wooden toy Samuel had been playing with lay on the floor. But Alara and the baby were gone. There were no signs of a struggle. Croft's men must have been watching, waiting for the moment Kyle left to meet the messenger. They had moved in with silent, swift precision. He had been so focused on Croft's next move that he had failed to protect them, just as he had failed to protect Lila. The same cold, sickening feeling of failure washed over him, a ghost of a grief he knew all too well. He looked at the note again. SS Silas Stone. The Stardust Mine. The name hit him like a physical blow. It was a played-out silver mine deep in the Badlands, a treacherous labyrinth of rickety tunnels and unstable shafts. And it was the place where he had finally cornered and killed Jedediah Stone. Croft was turning the site of Cale's victory into the stage for his final vengeful act. There was no choice, no room for a plan. This was a direct challenge, a path from which there was no deviation. He had to go. He spent the rest of the night preparing. He was no longer Cale, the quiet trapper. He was Black Wolf, the U.S. Marshal, preparing for his last and most important fight. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, the Colt, the rifle, and the long, sharp hunting knife that was a legacy from his Modoc father. He packed sparingly water, a handful of dried meat, and extra ammunition. Every item had a purpose. There was no room for sentiment, only for the tools of survival. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, he set out. He moved not with rage, but with a cold, focused clarity. The grief, the guilt, the anger, he packed it all away deep inside. To give in to emotion now would be to give Croft the victory. He needed to be the man he once was, calculating, relentless, and utterly in control. The journey to the Stardust Mine was a pilgrimage into his own past. He rode through the familiar, desolate landscape, each rock and canyon a memory. This was the territory he had once tamed, the land he had bled for in the name of the law. Now it was to be his final battleground. As he approached the mine, the sky began to darken. Not with the approaching night, but with an unnatural, sickly, yellow hue. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, carrying with it a fine, stinging dust. A sandstorm was brewing, a massive, violent tempest that would turn the world into a maelstrom of blinding grit and roaring wind. Croft had not just chosen the place, but the time. He was using the storm as a weapon, adding another layer of chaos to the confrontation. Cale dismounted a mile from the mine, tethering his horse in a sheltered cove. He would approach the rest of the way on foot, a shadow in the growing storm. The wind tore at his clothes, and the sand scoured his exposed skin. But he pressed on his eyes, fixed on the skeletal silhouette of the mine's headframe against the churning yellow sky. This was where it would end. In the heart of a storm, in the ghost of a battle he had fought long ago, he would face the man who had resurrected his past, only to destroy his future. The Stardust Mine was a skeletal wreck, a monument to greed and failure. Its main structure, a towering wooden headframe, groaned and swayed in the punishing wind, threatening to collapse at any moment. Corrugated iron sheets ripped free from the roofs of outbuildings, spinning through the air like deadly blades. The sandstorm had descended in its full fury, reducing visibility to a few feet, and turning the air into a suffocating, gritty fog. The roar of the wind was a physical force, a constant, deafening assault that made it impossible to hear anything else. Cale moved through the maelstrom like a phantom, his bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth, his eyes narrowed to slits. He used the storm's chaos as cover, slipping between dilapidated structures, his senses on high alert. Croft would have men posted watching for his approach. He spotted the first one huddled behind a stack of rotting timbers, trying to shield himself from the wind. Kyle circled around the howling gale, masking the sound of his approach. He was on the man as before he even knew he was there, a forearm locked around his throat, cutting off any cry of alarm. The man struggled briefly before Cale's cold, precise pressure rendered him unconscious. Cale dragged him into the shadows and moved on. He found the entrance to the main shaft, a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain. This was where Jedediah had made his last stand. Cale slipped inside the relative quiet of the tunnel, a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Lanterns, their flames flickering wildly in the drafts, cast long, dancing shadows down the main tunnel. He heard a voice echo from deep within the mine, amplified by the rock walls. It was Silas Stone. "Welcome, Marshal. I knew you would not disappoint me. I trust you enjoyed the storm I arranged for our reunion." The voice was calm, articulate, and laced with a chilling amusement. He was using the mine's acoustics to taunt him to turn the very environment into an instrument of psychological warfare. Kyle did not answer. He pressed on his Colt, now in his hand. The main tunnel branched into a network of smaller passages. It was a labyrinth, and Croft was the monster at its center. He found the second guard at a junction, his back to Kale, peering nervously into the darkness. Kale was a whisper behind him, and the cold barrel of his Colt pressing into the man's neck, a silent command. The guard froze, dropping his rifle with a clatter. Kale disarmed him and bound him with his own belt, leaving him in the darkness. "You are as resourceful as I remember." Marshal Croft's voice echoed again, closer this time. "But your skills will not save you here. This place is a tomb, my brother's tomb, and soon it will be yours." Kale followed the voice, moving deeper into the mine. He entered a large central cavern, the heart of the stardust. High above, shafts of dusty light filtered down from cracks in the ceiling, illuminating a scene of calculated cruelty. Silas Stone stood on a raised wooden platform on the far side of the cavern. He was a tall, well-dressed man, his appearance more suited to a San Francisco parlor than a derelict mine. His face was intelligent, handsome, but his eyes burned with a fanatical, grief-stricken fire. Below him, on a set of rusty ore cart tracks that ran over a deep black chasm, sat a single mine cart. Inside were Alara and Samuel. Alara's hands were tied, and a gag silenced her, but her eyes were wide with terror. She held Samuel tightly, trying to shield him from the horror of the situation. The cart was held in place on a steep incline by a single fraying rope, which was tied to a lever next to where Croft stood. "We are all here at last." Croft said, his voice now calm and conversational. "The righteous lawman, the innocent family he foolishly chose to protect, and the brother seeking a justice you denied him." "Let them go, Stone," Kale said, his voice dangerously low. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it has always been between you and me," Croft replied with a thin smile. "But you took my family. It is only fitting that I take yours. An eye for an eye. Is that not the foundation of your precious law?" As he spoke, the mine shuddered violently. A tremor caused by the sheer force of the storm raging outside sent a shower of dust and rock from the ceiling. The wooden platform Croft stood on groaned in protest. "You think this is justice?" Kyle said, taking a slow step forward, hiding behind a woman and a child. Croft's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of sudden raw fury. "You speak to me of justice. You who shot my brother down in this very spot. He was just a boy." "Your brother was a killer," Kale retorted, his voice hard as flint. "He made his choice when he drew on me." "He was my blood," Croft roared, his composure finally cracking. It was here in this moment that he unleashed the final, most venomous piece of his revenge. "Just as your wife was your blood. Did you ever wonder about that fire, Marshal? The official report called it an accident. A stray ember." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold, damp air. "I was there," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was passing through your town that night. I saw the smoke. I watched your house burn. I heard her screaming. And I did nothing. I stood there in the darkness, and I watched the flames take her, and I called it justice for Jedediah." The revelation struck Kale with the force of a physical blow. The careful control he had maintained, the cold focus of the lawman, shattered into a million pieces. all that was left was a pure, white-hot rage. He let out a primal roar and charged forward, his Colt bucking in his hand. Croft, anticipating the attack, kicked the lever beside him. The rope holding the minecart snapped free, and the cart began to roll slowly at first, then gaining speed as it headed toward the chasm. Alara's muffled scream was a sound of pure terror. Kael was faced with an impossible choice, the one Croft had engineered all along. His path to Croft was clear. He could kill the man who had watched his wife die, the man who had tormented him for 5 years. But to do so would be to condemn Alara and Samuel to a horrifying death. Vengeance or redemption. The past or the future. In that split second, as the mine groaned and trembled around them, Kyle saw Lila's face in his mind. Not in the flames, but as she was in life, her eyes full of a light that had always guided him away from the darkness. He chose life. He changed direction, veering away from Croft and sprinting along the tracks, trying to outrun the accelerating cart. Croft laughed a wild, triumphant sound and raised his own pistol to fire at Kael's back. But the mine had its own justice to deliver. Another, more violent tremor shook the cavern. The wooden platform beneath Croft's feet weakened by age, and the storm splintered and collapsed. With a cry of shock and rage, Silas Stone plunged into the darkness of a side tunnel below, his laughter cut short by the sound of splintering wood and falling rock. Kyle didn't look back. He poured every last ounce of his strength into his sprint. The cart was just feet from the edge of the chasm. He lunged, his fingers catching the rear axle. His boots scraped for purchase on the loose gravel, his muscles screaming in protest as he tried to slow the cart's momentum. It was too heavy. It was still moving, dragging him closer and closer to the abyss. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, he threw his body sideways, trying to derail the cart. The wheels shrieked against the track, and with a terrible groaning sound, the cart tipped, spilling Alara and Samuel out onto the ground, just as its front wheels went over the edge. It hung there for a heart-stopping second before plunging into the blackness below. Kael scrambled to Alara's side, his knife flashing as he cut her bonds and tore the gag from her mouth. She gasped for air, her arms wrapped protectively around a crying Samuel. They were alive. They were safe. The mine gave one final shuddering groan, and the entrance to the tunnel where Croft had fallen collapsed completely, sealing him in a tomb of his own making. The choice had been made for him. Silas Stone was gone, buried under the weight of his own hatred. Kyle looked at the pile of rubble, feeling not triumph, but a vast, empty exhaustion. His war was over. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. As the sun broke through the retreating clouds, its rays pierced the gloom of the mine, illuminating the cavern in a soft, hazy light. The world outside was washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of rain and wet earth. It was a world reborn. Kyle carried Samuel while helping a bruised and shaken Alara navigate their way out of the treacherous mine. When they emerged into the daylight, blinking against the sudden brightness, it felt like stepping out of a long, dark nightmare. The landscape, scoured by the storm, seemed new and unfamiliar. They found Kael's horse safe in its shelter and began the slow journey back to Harmony Creek. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had endured. A quiet understanding passed between them, a bond forged in terror and survival. Kael was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his charge. They were two survivors bearing the scars of a battle that had cost them both so much. Their return to town was a resurrection. The townsfolk who had huddled in their homes during the storm emerged to find the reclusive Kael walking down the main street with the widow and her child. But the fear that had once defined their view of him was gone, replaced by a sense of awe and respect. News of Croft's disappearance would spread, and while the details would become the stuff of legend, the truth was plain to see. The tyrant was gone, and this quiet, haunted man was the reason why. Sheriff Miller met them, his face a mixture of relief and shame. We heard the explosions from the mine," he stammered. "Is Croft—" "He's gone," Kyle said, his voice weary. "He won't be troubling this town again." The people of Harmony Creek, their collective breath held for so long under Croft's oppressive shadow, finally let it out. A quiet cheer went through the small crowd that had gathered. The spell of fear was broken. They were free. They rallied around Alara, offering her food, shelter, and support. For the first time since her husband's death, she was not alone. She was part of a community again, a community that Kale, in his quest for a personal peace, had inadvertently saved. Kale slipped away from the crowd, his work done. He returned to his cabin, the silence he had once craved now feeling empty and hollow. The ghosts were still there, but they were different now. The specter of his failure with Lila was joined by the phantom of Silas Stone, a man so consumed by grief that he had become a monster. Kale saw in him a dark reflection of what he could have become had he let his own sorrow fester into hatred. The fight had not just been for Alara and Samuel's lives. It had been for his own soul. Months passed. The harsh desert winter gave way to a vibrant spring. The land so recently a battleground was now bursting with new life. Harmony Creek was thriving. With Croft's oppressive influence gone, the town had come together, its people no longer afraid. They were rebuilding not just their homes, but their community. Alara had refused to sell her homestead. With the help of her new friends from town, she had repaired the house, dug a new well, and planted her crops. The farm was becoming the thriving place her husband had always dreamed it would be. She was a fixture in the town, now her resilience an inspiration to them all. Samuel, growing bigger and stronger every day, was the town's cherished child, a symbol of their renewed hope. Kale had remained at his cabin, but the walls of his solitude were no longer so high. He came to town more often, not just for supplies, but to help with the rebuilding, his strength and skill a welcome asset. The townsfolk no longer saw him as the haunted recluse. They simply called him Kyle, their friend, their protector. The name Black Wolf was a legend that belonged to another time. One clear, bright morning, he made a journey he had not made in a long time. He climbed the hill behind his cabin to the single simple grave marked by a plain wooden cross, Lila. He stood before it for a long time, the gentle breeze rustling the new leaves on the trees. He reached under his shirt and pulled out the silver locket. He had recovered it, had fought and bled for it, because he thought it was all he had left of her. But he realized now that he had been wrong. He had her memory, her spirit, the lessons she had taught him about kindness and hope. That was what he carried inside him. The locket was just a thing, a silver anchor to a past of grief. He opened it, looking at her smiling face one last time. He saw not a source of pain, but a gentle encouragement to live. He pressed a kiss to the cool metal, a final, silent goodbye. Then he carefully placed the locket on the wooden headstone, leaving it to catch the morning sun. He was letting her go. He was letting the grief go. He turned and looked down at the valley below. He could see Harmony Creek bustling with life. He could see the smoke rising from the chimney of Alara's farmhouse. He saw her step out onto the porch with Samuel on her hip and wave. It was not a gesture of romance, but of family, of belonging. He had come to this place seeking an ending, a quiet place to let his life fade into memory. But he had found a new beginning. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past, but a man with a future, a guardian, a friend, a part of a community. He raised his hand and waved back a slow smile spreading across his face. He had found a new purpose. He had found peace.